I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, therefore, that you and your descendants may live. It's quite a speech that Moses offers here, and it's quite a choice that he lays out before the people. Every person in the room this morning surely knows that our lives are made up of decisions. We make choices about who we will live with and which relationships will be the most important to us, about what kind of work we will do and where we will do it and when we will retire from it. We make choices about what we will eat or not eat, about how we will use our time and money, about the values that we will embrace. For nearly all of us, at one time or another, the choices may even seem to be too much. So much so that a trip down the cereal aisle at Albertsons can be paralyzing. I don't know about you, but I hate going to a restaurant where I don't already know what I want to order. I know what I want if we go to Chili's. I know what I want from Sadie's or Matucci's or Panda Express. And if I don't already know what I want, then no, I don't want to go there. Just don't. Many of our choices, especially the big ones, boil down to knowing when to say yes and when to say no. And that's because many of our choices carry an implicit trade-off. If we say yes to more family time, that means no to some of our ambitions at work. If we say yes to caring for an ailing family member, then that can mean no, even for exercise or self-care. And if our scripture tells us anything, it's that it has always been this way for the people of faith. And that's because to live by faith means knowing how to use our convictions about God when saying yes and when saying no. Clearly, that is Moses' point in his great farewell sermon at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Moses had taken the Hebrew people as far as he could, and now they stood at the threshold of the promised land. It had been 40 years since they escaped slavery back in Egypt. Those were 40 hard years of learning how to say yes to trusting God out there in the desert. They had to say yes to trusting God when the Egyptian chariots were bearing down on them and there was nothing in front of them except the wide Red Sea. They had to say yes when the water ran out. They had to say, I will trust you when there was no food. They had to say yes when marauding desert tribes threatened them with violence. In the part of the farewell sermon just before the section that Manny read for us, Moses tells the people to remember what they have learned about God's faithfulness. He reminds them of the wonderful future that waits just across the Jordan River in the Promised Land. Then he confronts the Hebrews with a great choice. I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying the Lord, and holding fast to God. Now, by this time, the Bible tells us Moses was 120 years old. And in 120 years, you see a lot. He knew that the survival of his people was completely dependent on the choices that they made. And that's because, as Moses had discovered, God honors our choices. Just like in Matthew 19:22, where Jesus invites a young man to leave his possessions and wealth behind and to come and follow him, but the young man will not. Instead, he turns away from Jesus in sorrow, and Jesus lets him go. Jesus does not chase after him. Jesus doesn't offer to bend the requirements for him. He doesn't offer to do anything further to woo or entice this young man. He just lets him go. He honors his choice. It's the same thing we see in a terrifying passage in Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul is describing what he sees as the complete depravity of the Roman culture around him. He says, therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts and to the degradation of their bodies, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. They worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Paul's point is that if you turn away from God, God will let you go. God will honor your choices. God honors our choices, even those choices that would lead to our destruction. And so now, 38 years later, Moses and the people are... I got that backwards. And so, in the passage that Manny read for us, we need to remember that 38 years earlier, Moses and the people had already stood on the cusp of the promised land. But then, 38 years prior, the people had been afraid to enter the land because some of the Hebrew spies came back reporting that there were giants out there and that all of the cities were fortified and that there was no way the Israelites could hope to prevail. The people heard these reports and their fears outweighed their faith. Their anxieties got the better of them. They decided that the nomadic life might not be so bad. And the God who called Moses from the burning bush, the God who sent plagues and brought the Israelites out of slavery, the God who had seen these people through so much and who had so much invested in them, that God accepted their choice and let them wander in the desert until that entire generation had passed. Which just it blows my mind. God values relationship enough to give these folks the power to choose. God gave them the opportunity to push forward with a yes, but when they said no, God honored their no, even if it was breaking God's heart. And so for 38 years, the people of Israel lived outside of the blessing that God had intended for them. For 38 years, they circled the airport, unable to land the plane. Moses is now preaching to their children. This new generation faces the same choice that their parents did. And Moses cautions them here to choose carefully. He wants them to choose carefully because he doesn't want to see them make the same choice that their ancestors did. Moses wants them to choose wisely because he's devoted close to 50 years of his life to delivering a people who may just decide they don't want to be delivered. And he wants them to choose carefully because I think Moses knows pretty well what lies ahead. Even if they say yes, even if they follow Joshua into the promised land, even if they are successful in possessing the land and settling it, once they get there, things are going to be different. They're going to meet neighbors who worship other gods. They're going to have to go from being nomadic hunters and gatherers to being settled farmers and shepherds. They're going to have to raise their children in a world that looks nothing like the world that they knew growing up. And as they do all of those things, they're going to be tempted by the values and the practices of their neighbors. They're going to be tempted by well-meaning strangers who say, if you just keep a little shrine to Baal in your kitchen, your crops will grow better. Really, you should try it. As they spread out and settle the land, they're going to be tempted to think that they are now in this alone, that their success and failure depends entirely on them, that God has just left them to their own devices. And Moses knows, and God knows, that their yes means nothing unless they are free to say no. And so Moses enjoins the people, say no to being afraid. Say no to the myth of self-reliance. Say yes to loving God, to obeying God, to holding fast to Him. This must have been such an important point, because we pretty much get the same list. Love, obey, hold fast. We pretty much get that same list twice, in verse 16 and in verse 20 of this passage. And in each of these phrases, and each of the phrases from this list, provides a definition, a clue about the term that precedes it. To love God is to obey God, is to do what God says, is to go where God leads. And to obey is to hold fast to God. To rely on God above all else is to trust in God and not on your own understanding. But I have to say it seems strange to be talking about obedience these days. At least as we might apply obedience to ourselves. I mean, many of us have a certain tolerance for expecting obedience from others. But personal obedience, applied to ourselves, that is not exactly a big seller, you know? We are better at recognizing our rights, our victimizations, our deeply felt needs. But obedience sounds downright medieval. And what does obedience have to do with loving God? Aren't we free? Didn't Jesus get us off the hook for that obedience thing? No. Absolutely not. Jesus taught that everyone is obeying something. And the person who is most enslaved is the one who serves the illusion that the next thing is going to bring them happiness. You've seen this, right? We've known folks, all of us, I think, who are just sure that the next thing, the next school, the next job, the next relationship, the next diet, the next doctor, the next whatever, is going to be the one that pulls it all together for us. When I was young, my parents would sometimes fall asleep in front of the TV in the family room at night. And I learned that, oh good, she's not listening. I learned that if one waited until the weather was over, that you could creep into the living room during the sports. And you could do this kind of carpet crawl, combat style, into position, and watch Dragnet, and then the Twilight Zone, because that's what came on Channel 13 after the news went off. Dragnet was fine. Dragnet reinforced my emerging sense that the moral order of the universe was sure. But then the Twilight Zone was there to throw all of Sergeant Friday's certainties into doubt. And in particular, I remember a Twilight Zone episode about a man who died suddenly and who was carried off to a splendid place where his every wish was immediately granted. He was delighted to discover that somehow he had made it to paradise in spite of the life that he had lived. And now in this glorious afterlife, he need only to ask for money, for beautiful women, mansions, a Rolls Royce. All of his wishes came true. But then after a while, he grew bored. And then his boredom turned to misery, and eventually he started to go crazy. Finally, he just couldn't stand it anymore, and he screamed to the angel, "I can't take this anymore. There's nothing to accomplish. I can't stand heaven. I want to go to the other place." And the angel just laughed and said, "This is the other place." Whenever we devote ourselves simply to our own appetites, whenever the answer to ourselves is always yes, we create not heaven, but our own hell. And so, no is a faithful word. It's a holy word. It's not just that no provides the backdrop that makes our yeses count for something. No sets the boundary that makes faithfulness possible. And Moses understands this. Saying no to fear makes it possible to say yes to faith. Saying no to greed makes generosity possible. Saying no to the people who would take advantage of us and who would sponge off us frees us from resentment and enabling dysfunction. Saying no to selfishness keeps us from being a confederacy of individuals all grabbing whatever it is that they want. Saying no to the constant distractions of our electronic devices makes us free to be present to each other and to God. The thing about following Jesus is that he asks us to say no to an awful lot of things that our culture heartily endorses. He asks us to say no to the myths, to the terrible lies that money will solve your problems, or that there's nothing any one person can do, so why try, or that celebrity equals importance, or that might always makes right. He asks to say no to the idea that the ends justify the means, or that the world can be set right by violence. Jesus knew those things, and he calls us away from them. Moses could see those things, and that's why he says to us, "See, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. Look, I set before you life and death, prosperity and adversity, blessings and curses. So choose life. Say yes to it. But say enough no's that there is room to give your yes to the things that really matter. Make sure that you say enough no's that you've got room to say yes to what really matters, so that you and your descendants may live." Amen.